Hey everybody, thanks for coming for our webinar on a vital set of issues that are very much in the national debate right now on how this is a new version of a presentation we've been giving for some time. There's some new slides and some new pieces in here, so I'm excited to bring them to you. We call this presentation How Improvements Along the Border and in our immigration system and in Mexico are impacting the national immigration debate. So it'll probably take 15-20 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. Those of you who are watching live, some of you will be watching a recording, have the ability to ask questions at the end if we have time. But let's get to it. So the premise of this presentation is that even though Congress has not moved on immigration in recent years, that since McCain and Kennedy introduced their original bill back in 2005, that the landscape on this issue has changed a great deal, and that in order to make good public policy, one needs to understand the changes in the landscape and respond and have policy that responds to those changes. So the first step is the first section of our presentation is going to be to discuss how the border itself is much, much safer today than it was in 2005. So first of all, since there began to be a significant investment in increasing border security, we've seen a tripling of the amount of money spent in what is a broad definition of border security. This is a significant amount of money now spent every year. One of the things that it's brought us is many more, as the President said a couple of days ago, more boots on the ground. Far many more border guards who are patrolling in between the ports of entry and expanding working more effectively local law enforcement to ensure that we don't have a porous U.S. border, as some say. And the important thing is not just that we've spent money, but that the money that we've spent has actually yielded significant results. If you look at crime as one measure of border safety and security, there's been a precipitous drop in crime along all parts of the U.S.-Mexico border, despite the fact that during this period, the cartels on the Mexican side have grown more violent. It's really a rather remarkable public policy accomplishment. This chart shows one way of measuring this success, which is that there's been a huge decrease in violent crime on the U.S. side of the Mexican border. This breaks down some of the urban areas just to give you a sense that this is real. I mean, and looking at San Diego and El Paso, which are two of the biggest parts of two of the biggest cities along the border, violent crime is a third of what it was 10 years ago. A third. This is a significant drop, right, by any measure. And take El Paso, which is right across from Ciudad Juarez, which many consider to be the most dangerous city in the Western Hemisphere. You've seen this crime rate drop so significantly. This is a rather remarkable public policy accomplishment, and DHS and local and state law enforcement along the border really deserve incredible credit for having pulled this off. Next is that on the issue of apprehension and what's happening in terms of the folks coming across the border, the aspiration in the new Senate bill is for there to be what we essentially call a 90% apprehension rate. It was originally in the high traffic corridors where there are lots of undocumented immigrants coming through, but it's now in the current Senate bill. It's been extended to the entire border. And people have argued that this is sort of an unrealistic expectation, but if you look at where things stand now in the 5 high traffic corridors, right, 4 of the 5 are either at 90 or very close to it. Obviously, there are issues in the Rio Grande Valley that need to be addressed, but with more money and time and greater tools, greater technology tools, I think certainly it's reasonable in the high traffic corridors to assume that after 5 years, we can get this number up to be 90. I think some of the low traffic corridors, it's going to be harder. There's going to have to be significant debate about how realistic the 90% apprehension rate is for low traffic corridors. and whether or not there's enough resources and a strong enough plan to actually come about. But certainly in the high traffic corridors where most of the flow is, we can see, I think it's reasonable to assume we can get up to 90%. We also know that that the actual flow of undocumented has plummeted, right? And some of this is the slowdown in the American economy. Some of it's the significantly improving Mexican economy. But some of this is also just that we've got more assets and fewer people are getting through, and it's becoming a less attractive undertaking for many. Even if you look at the undocumented, the unauthorized immigrants who are trying to get through, who get caught at the border, we've now gone from it being overwhelmingly Mexican to now about 50% people other than Mexicans. And that's both a sign of the increase of others, but also the fact that people who are nearby, the closest people who could walk across the border, they themselves are slowing way down in their effort to get across. Some of that has to do with their understanding that it's much harder to get across than it used to be. And that drop in flow with the normal sort of migration of people back to their home countries, which happens all the time. It happened in the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century. It happens now. That net migration has gone to zero. This is, again, an incredible public policy accomplishment from where we were, if I go backwards, right? If you look at the flow that we saw, a decade ago, we've seen this drop of the flow, and the net migration is now down to zero. You'll hear people in the public policy debate saying millions of Mexicans are streaming across the border every year. It used to be that there were hundreds of thousands, high hundreds of thousands, a much smaller number now. Real progress has been made. So next up is the immigration system is better. The second part of the presentation is that the immigration system itself is better. The president and the administration haven't stood still. We don't have a good immigration system. That's why we want a fix in the law. But there are things the president's done and DHS have done in recent years since the administration came in 2009 that have made the immigration system substantially better. These are some, on the chart here. These are a list of some things. The most significant of all of them has been the legal theory behind prioritizing what's called prosecutorial discretion, or the prioritizing of criminal migrants for deportation. This seems so commonsensical, right? That if you have limited resources every year, the system can only deport and remove out of the country a certain number because of just limited resources. That one would then prioritize the criminals for moving to the front of the deportation line, and that we would de-emphasize some of the regular, everyday, unauthorized folks from getting swept up in the deportation process. This seemed like a relatively non-controversial decision, and what it allowed, what came out of that later, after this had begun to be implemented, is that there was a clear understanding that if we could prioritize who was going to the front of the deportation line, then we could also prioritize who's going to go back to the back of the deportation line. And so what the president did in last summer of 2012, was he said through his DACA decision, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that if you were a DREAM-eligible youth and you were unauthorized and documented, that you could apply, that we would essentially grant you temporary legal status and ensure that you would not be deported using this legal rationale. It was a breakthrough in many ways, a legal, political breakthrough on so many levels. I'm so proud of the president for having had the courage to really be this ambitious about using this tool that he has. And it's obviously made the lives of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of deserving young people much better in a very short period of time. I could spend much more time on this, but we'll go on. Next, and I think this is something that is perhaps not, in my conversations with reporters and folks, is not as well understood as it probably needs to be. But, for a long time on the Republican side, the opposition, the Republican Party has been split, right? There have been McCain, Reagan, Bush, those who really want to have a modern immigration system that support comprehensive immigration reform. Jeb Bush today just came out and said he supports the Senate bill. And then there was the part of the Republican Party that resisted. And, in 2005, the House Republicans actually passed legislation to not only self-deport 11 million people, but to actually deport 11 million people and to make them felons in the process. So there's been real opposition on the Republican side. That opposition to CIR was never really congealed into a sort of a national movement. It was a congressional group. I mean, it wasn't like there was two ideas of how to reform and fix the immigration system. There was one, CIR, and then this sort of hodgepodge, incoherent, group on the other side who had their own objections for whatever reason. Some of them came around on this deportation effort. But in 2009, led in part by this state senator named Russell Pierce in Arizona, Arizona passed SB 1070 during that legislative session 2009-2010, which essentially created a new national strategy for the Republican Party and conservatives, which was neither deportation nor CIR. It was what was called self-deportation attrition. The basic theory was that we would make the life of unauthorized immigrants, undocumented immigrants, so horrible that they would self-deport, they would leave. And so everything that was part of that movement and that effort around SB 1070 was designed to essentially harass and create a climate of fear in the undocumented community, right? And in the broader Latino community, because some of these things, who's undocumented, the whole question about whether, what's the old line, driving while brown, right? The question is, would there be regular, everyday people, Latinos, swept up into this sort of, what could be in certain communities, racial profiling and so on. That theory of self-deportation attrition had a boomlet, right? Passed SB 1070, laws started getting passed in other states. This ideology captured the Republican nominee for president in 2012, amazingly, right, shockingly, compared to where we were in 2008 with John McCain. But then in 2012, that movement started to peak, and when the Supreme Court dealt SB 1070 a death blow and said this is the province of the federal government, states can't get into making immigration law. To me, that decision was sort of the Gettysburg of the self-deportation attrition movement. It was going to continue, but it had been dealt a death blow politically. And the administration really deserves a lot of credit for having challenged and won that case in court. Additionally, during the 2011-2012 electoral cycle, Russell Pierce, who rode this SB 1070 success to become the Senate Majority Leader in Arizona, was a coalition of business groups who were worried about the way that Arizona was being perceived. They had seen a significant drop-off in tourism, for example, and other political activists ran a recall campaign and removed Russell Pierce from office while he was the Senate Majority Leader. Extraordinary thing that happened. He ran for his seat again and lost again in the fall elections in 2012. What this means is that if you're a 30-year-old Republican who wants to be an anti-immigrant leader, that this has become a little bit more of an unattractive career path for you, right? The conservative Supreme Court knocked down essentially most of these state laws. The most prominent elected leader of this movement was recalled from office. Mitt Romney went down in flames in 2012, and I think it's done a lot. What's happened is that the self-deportation alternative to CIR has been severely weakened in the last 12 months, which to me makes the passage, which may make it more possible for Republicans who are on the bubble to come along the CIR bandwagon. There isn't as coherent an alternative to CIR as there was, a year ago. Finally, the third part is about Mexico, because it's obviously a huge percentage of the unauthorized, undocumented immigrants in the U.S. have been of Mexican descent. And, Mexico has changed an awful lot, to a great degree driven by what's happened with NAFTA since we passed NAFTA almost 20 years ago. But let's look, right? I mean, if you look at what's happened with GDP in Mexico over this post-NAFTA period, we've seen, a tripling of it since 1993. And if you look at after the crash, the economic crash that Mexico had, you've seen a five-fold increase in the GDP of Mexico during this period. Mexico is now the 12th or 13th largest economy in the world, depending on measures. and is becoming a true economic powerhouse. This puts in perspective a little bit about where Mexico fits into the where it is relative to others. It is now in between Australia and Korea, but is because Mexico is a big country, 120 million people and growing. Over time and through economic investment and growth, Mexico is going to become a top 10 economy and be equal to the size of Japan by 2050. Kind of a remarkable thing. So we have to look at the fact that we have this economic dynamo, this powerhouse, just right nearby. During that period, a lot of what's driven Mexican growth, and even though Mexico has been very outwardly focused, it's been a leader in passing free trade agreements with other nations. It has aggressively embraced liberalized trade as a core national strategy. This demonstrates here what's happened with the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship. This is an extraordinary story. I mean, I still, every time I look at this, am amazed. And if you look at what's happened since 2009, I mean, we will probably be close to $600 billion of trade of goods and services between Mexico and the U.S. by the end of this year. That's a doubling of the trade relationship since 2009. Remarkable achievement, right? By any measure. Now the U.S. and Mexico have one of the most important trade relationships between any two countries in the entire world. This is now a big one, and it is critical for creating jobs on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. Mexico is our third largest trading partner now. We trade almost as much with Mexico as we do with China, for example. It's really an amazing thing. And it is a place that buys our stuff too. I mean, of that big flow that happens between our two countries, Mexico is buying up a lot of American stuff. And Mexico buys twice as much from us as China does, for example, and almost 4 times as much as Japan, and 5 times as much almost as Germany, right? So hugely important trade relationship. Estimates are that 6 million jobs in the United States are dependent upon Mexico trade. In Mexico, not only has there been growth, but it's becoming more broadly shared, right? I mean, we showed that the economy since around when NAFTA passed had tripled, right? What's important is that the per capita income has gone up about just as much. I mean, that the proportion, it's a little bit less, but the proportion is tracked pretty closely, meaning that the prosperity in Mexico has been more broadly shared than one might have imagined. There's still tremendous challenges with poverty. Mexico has a long way to go, but this has not been growth that's accrued only to the people at the top. It's been empowering for people in the middle and people aspiring to be in the middle, which is one of the reasons why we believe you've seen a drop in the net flow of migration to the U.S. because there are more reasons for people to stay at home and work. Another huge contributing factor to the slowdown in migration is the decline in birth rates, right? I mean, 2.1 is replacement rate. Most of the developed world is around 2.1 to 1.9, sort of in that realm. Mexico is now a Catholic country that has a birth rate that is very similar to traditional, more developed countries, which means that the baby boom. That part of what happened is that our argument is there was this historical flow of events, the combination of NAFTA, a large number of not well-educated rural workers who had a hard time finding work in the post-NAFTA environment, a booming U.S. economy, which became a draw for the unauthorized workers into the U.S. These things are that period, that historical set of circumstances that created the huge Mexican diaspora in the United States is just going to be very hard to replicate in the future. And it addresses one of the core arguments, I think, that you hear from some in the immigration debate, which is, well, this is all going to start up again if we don't have a strong enforcement regime. Well, we just don't think demographically that's likely at this point. So what this has resulted in, as we went over earlier, right, is that the flow is dropping, and we think that it's not just those who argue it's because it's the American economy has slowed down. They just don't understand the complexity of what's happened here. I mean, the border regime is so much stronger than it was. The demographic realities and the economic growth in Mexico are so different than they were. there's far more reason to stay at home than there was before. And if you're a Mexican migrant, you're not ignorant to know that there's been rancorous racial politics here in the U.S. about the existence of the Mexican diaspora. And so there's been, I think, also not only people described as push and pull, but there's been less push from Mexico because people, on balance, things are good at home. They're getting better. Obviously, the cartels are a big problem, but there's work. Unemployment rate in Mexico is much lower than it is here in the United States. And there's just less reason to go than there was. This is really important, right, in terms of designing public policy. And so look what's happened, right? We've had this huge drop in net migration. So the bottom line for us is that, what we've seen in recent years is that this administration, with more money, a better strategy, greater cooperation with Mexico, has made the border much better, right? We've seen crime way down, net migration zero, trade has exploded. It's been a remarkable accomplishment. Mexico itself is going through profound change, which leads one to believe that we'll never have a similar set of historical circumstances that will push so many low-skilled workers out of Mexico into the United States. And finally, but due to the size of the unauthorized and undocumented population, it's critical that comprehensive immigration reform, just got something in my eye there, that comprehensive immigration reform address in a thoughtful way not only border security, and frankly we have much less to do than we did when the president came into office, and I think these are achievable things that are being discussed and debated. But we have to have a path to citizenship and a resolution of the unauthorized and undocumented community here in the United States. I think we can do all these things. We're very optimistic that despite difficult politics, we can get this done. And so thank you for being with us. If you have any questions about any of this, please come back to our website at ndn.org. We also have a wonderful site called 21border.com, which looks at the border issues every day. And I hope you'll join me in being optimistic and doing everything you can to help make sure that the good Senate bill that's been passed is signed into law this year. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.